Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome into your next conversation here at the Doha Forum. Dan Murphy with you from CNBC, and thank you for that kind introduction. So this next conversation is going to focus on the debt dilemma, and we'll take a look at the macroeconomic implications, of course, of rising debt, what it means for global governments, institutions, and policymakers, and also look at how it's being addressed around the world. Before we begin the conversation, though, I think we have to also make a note here that, of course, our conversation in this conference is taking place against the backdrop of renewed conflict in our region. So first, I would begin with His Excellency, the Minister, for some thoughts on this. We've actually just finished a conversation on CNBC about the very topic. Your Excellency, as you look at the implications of this renewed conflict in our region, how are you assessing the impact for economies and the investability of this part of the world?
Thank you. Actually, it gives me a great pleasure to be again, to the Doha Forum, and thank you, for hosting me in this event. As we think, of course, wars are not good for investments. This is, the rule of thumb. But definitely, I think the investment, the region has been really very well established long time ago. And also, in terms of there are different economies, different performance of economies in the region itself. There are certain economies who are doing extremely well, certain economies, going some challenges. So I think this will not be changed due to the war in Gaza. Definitely this will, I think it will continue. And our hope, actually, speaking of the war in Gaza, first of, to reach, a ceasefire and a peaceful solution for the conflict as soon as possible. It's not good for anybody. It's a human catastrophe there, what we are seeing, children, women, and really, I think we should call for a stop in this war as soon as possible. Not for the sake of investment, but really for the sake of humanity, to begin with. But as I say, from financial, from economy, it should not change the picture, of the region itself. I think there are, as I said, countries who are doing very good, they will continue to do very good. And countries with challenges, maybe they have a chance now to improve in terms of their performance. What we have seen here, the performance of the economies, even during the last 2 years, we have seen this, differentiation between two different performance of economies. And while the GCC is performing very well, I think some countries really, suffered from inflation, suffered from high interest rates, and other issues with the economies.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So let's unpack the conversation around debt, which is, of course, critical for global investors. Rising public debt has political, social, and economic implications. Your Excellency, first to you, how is Qatar managing its resources to have sustainability in public spending and in debt?
We have developed a medium-term fiscal policy framework. And the purpose of the fiscal policy framework is basically to review different revenue scenarios, for the countries going forward, like, we have 20, 30 years view in the future, and also, assess the spending ceilings and the sectors to spend, and how to be flexible in our spending to divert the spending to the right sectors, to the growth sectors going forward. And the idea of this fiscal policy framework to become disciplined in our view in the future, and to use different tools, depending on the conditions we see in the future, and also to decide what to do in terms of deficit and also in terms of surplus. Surplus, for example, we have a very clear formula. Part of the surplus goes to the debt, part of the surplus goes to Qatar Investment Authority for investment for the future generation and to provide intergeneration equities. And also part of it goes to the, to the reserve of the country with the central bank and to build the reserves of the countries. And we have very clear targets, like in terms of numbers, what we want to reach and how the formula changes as we go along. But the idea is really to become very prudent in our, fiscal policy and to become disciplined, going forward. It's not like, you have good year, surplus, and you spend so much money. Then when you have a bad year, you go after the people. So the idea is really to be consistent in your view.
Before I bring Borga into the conversation, I thought we could go over to Akinwumi first, particularly to look at this from the African context. Looking at some of the numbers here, it's quite extraordinary. The current public debt in Africa estimated to be about 546 billion, or about 1/4 of the continent's GDP. So what work are you doing over at AFDB to mitigate some of these debt vulnerabilities and promote sustainable development across the African continent?
Well, thank you very much. First, thank you for inviting me to the Doha Forum. It's great to be here. I think this morning the UN Secretary General actually talked about it when he said that in times of debt, it's like people are drowning under debt. In fact, the numbers are more than what you just said. If you look at Africa's debt situation in 2022, total external debt, total debt stock, it's actually $1.1 trillion. And that will rise to $1.13 trillion by the end of this year, which we are basically just finishing. And what's particularly troublesome about it is what has happened in terms of the number of countries that are in debt distress. You have today 25 countries that are either in debt distress or already in high risk of debt distress, right? Now, the question, though, is as we think of debt and what we do about it, the African Development Bank, of course, we have the same things as the Minister was saying: public financial management, domestic resource mobilization, and making sure that you can have also reduction in illicit capital flows, all of those things. However, for a multilateral approach, it requires that we understand the structure of the debt itself. What is changing and how can we respond to it? And I think there are 5 things I want to say about what's changing about Africa's debt. It's that concessional financing used to be my governor when you were there in government. It used to be at that time, in the 2000s, 52% of all the financing debt was actually bilateral debt, which was all Paris Club debt. Today, it's 25%. But if you look at what has happened, the structure is that commercial debt and also private Eurobond debt went from 17% to 44% today. So when we talk about how we deal with that, we have to understand that structural shift in the debt dynamics like that. The second one is the role of China. China, just in the mid-2000s, was only accounting for 1% of Africa's debt. Today, it's 14% of Africa's debt. Most of that, of course, for infrastructure. And the other thing that actually I find more bothersome as I think about the debt situation is the fact that a lot of this now is natural resource-backed loans, which I actually don't like at all, because they are not transparent, they are not accountable, they make debt resolution completely very, very difficult to do. But the spread also, if you look at the interest rate that is being paid, I'm from a multilateral development finance institution. We don't charge more than 1%, right? Bilaterals probably do about 1.2%. China is about 3.2%. But the private debt, commercial debt, is 6.8%, sometimes up to 8% and all that. So that spread on the coupons for many of these is very, very high. And most importantly, what creates the bunching, if I can call it that, about debt payments today, it's just the short duration of many of this debt. It's 10 years versus if it's Multilateral Development Bank, it will be like 40-year money. So really, as we think about that, I think in terms of solutions that we are doing, we are working as part of the global financial architecture to address this debt issue. Let me just say about 4 ways in which we are doing it. First is we are part of the G20 Common Framework, which I think it's doing very well with regard to Chad, with regard to Zambia, with regard also to Ghana, and also to Ethiopia. But it's still very slow, it's very slow, and I think we need to make it work much faster so that you can have debt treatment and debt restructuring and debt resolution in a much faster way. You remember when we had the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, it took forever. Africa lost a decade, and so we shouldn't do that again. The second one is that no more natural resource-backed loans. They make no sense, And third, as far as I'm concerned, it's also the issue of how we get concessional financing. Given what I said earlier, we at the bank, for example, we have what's called the African Development Fund, and that fund is what we use for the least or low-income countries in Africa. Now, we are using the equity we have in it, which is $25 billion, to go to the capital markets and raise an additional $27 billion of low-interest money, long-term money, that we can actually use to support these countries. The other thing that we are doing at the bank to respond to this is in terms of the use of guarantees. We use partial risk guarantees, partial credit guarantees. to support countries when they go to, whether you're issuing Euro bonds or they're borrowing commercial, to stretch the tenor and also to lower the interest rate. We've done that for Egypt, 500 million euros. We've done that for Senegal. We've just finished that yesterday at our board, and we do more. And last thing I just want to say is, as we do all of this, Africa is super exposed. It's the only continent where if you go to an hospital and you have malaria and they take you from that malaria plane and put you in surgery, that's a problem. Africa has no financial structure around it, buffers to prevent it from exogenous shocks, just like you have in Europe with the European financial mechanism and the Arab financial mechanism. So we've made the decision that we are going to create the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism to protect Africa from many of these exogenous shocks that doesn't lead to illiquidity or insolvency. So these are the things that we are doing as a bank to continue to do that. But I also end on the fact that there's something that I see that doesn't help us, which is how the rating agencies treat Africa. I think the credit rating agencies are not fair in the way they look at Africa. Africa is rated so much for the same amount of risk profile. Africa pays maybe 600 basis points, 800 basis points more than similar countries. So I think as part of that solution, there needs to be a proper evaluation of the actual risk of Africa. Africa is not as risky as people say. I think those things are very, very important. So you don't start borrowing money and galloping how much you're paying just because you are not being priced properly. So we are very much involved in that.
Can I just follow up with that point there? What would you say is the most critical challenge or most important vulnerability in the year ahead for the continent from a financing and financial perspective?
Well, that is, I was talking to Bonge when he was coming in, and he was asking me whether things were going to be better in Davos when we come, and I said, well, Davos is very cold, and he said, climate change. No, the answer is climate change. Africa today contributes only 3% cumulatively to emissions. But we suffer disproportionately from the negative consequences of it. The continent loses today $7 to $15 billion a year, and that's projected to rise to, roughly $40 billion a year by 2030 if all this happens. So it's how we mobilize. We're all in UAE for the COP. It's how we mobilize capital to allow Africa, in terms of climate finance, to climate-proof itself against many of these shocks. And we are doing something about that at the bank. We've committed at the bank that we will put 40% of our resources to climate finance. Today, we are at 44% of all of our finances that we exceeded that. We said that climate adaptation is a problem for Africa because we have no choice. Secretary General Guterres said we should put 50-50 into mitigation adaptation. We are at 67% of all of our climate finance in adaptation. We are the highest in the world in terms of share going into that. And while we were just last week in UAE, we launched a program called Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which is a $25 billion program to essentially support Africa to adapt to climate change. So I can't think of any headwind more important than how to support Africa to climate-proof itself and to insure itself from these catastrophic weather-related events.
That's a great point. And Borge, we'll bring you into the conversation here. Thank you for being here. When you assess the challenge as well, global debt now sitting at around $307 trillion. That's a record according to the IIF. How are you thinking about this challenge, and what does it mean from a global macroeconomic perspective?
So it's a big challenge. We are faced with excessive debt. I think we haven't really internalized how much this debt is now. It's close to 300% of the global GDP. And we haven't seen this kind of debt since the Napoleonic Wars. I think that shows us what we're really into. Even the largest economy in the world, the United States of America, 25% of the global GDP, 5% of the global population, they're going to use $1 trillion just to manage their debt, pay interest, $1 trillion. So the biggest expense in the US national budget will this year be paying their debt. Of course, having the reserve currency of the world and also having an economy that is still growing pretty much. The US will be able to manage this. But there is a lot of countries that are in deep trouble, and they're using more and more of the money that should have been invested in research and development, in education and healthcare, to paying off their debt. And as Mr. De Sina also underlined, unfortunately many of these countries are in Africa, where the need for investments are huge in those sectors to improve competitiveness. And then we are faced with a change in the structure of the global economy. What is growing today is the digital economy. Digital economy is around 15% of the global economy today, but is growing 2.5 times faster than any other sector. And the challenge is that in a digital economy, it is a tendency that the winner takes it all. We have seen this so far with the big platform companies. And if the growth is coming in the coming years in the digital space, and we also have already the digital inequalities there. 3.8 billion people on our planet are not connected digitally, at least not at an affordable and rate. And if the growth is coming then in areas, at least you have to have access digitally, and your country is also faced with a lot of debt, then there is a lot of challenges ahead. And I think we need to develop new tools in a new world to handle and also support developing countries that have met an impasse when it comes to their debt situation. Because the price of inaction in this area far exceeds the price of action.
Borge, what about the secondary impacts here as well? It's also said that one man's debt is another man's asset. The main holder of US debt is, of course, China. So do you see this as perhaps being the next flashpoint in the geoeconomic rivalry between the US and China? Could debt be one of the flashpoints in that rivalry?
I think both these two big economies, also called G2, have their own challenges related to debt. As I said, it's easier to inflate yourself out of any debt if you have the reserve currency of the world. I think the US will be able to handle it, but of course there is a bit of polarization also in the US political system, so this also needs quite tough decisions in the years to come. China is faced with also structural challenges that they will have to take on. But not to be too pessimistic in this though. If we met a year ago, I would have been even more pessimistic on the global economy. We are growing with 3% this year, $8 trillion US dollars, so moving from 100 trillion US dollars to 108. 45% of this growth comes from the US, and 55 comes mainly then from fast-growing emerging economies, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Poland. So there are areas where we are seeing growth, and look at India, still a developing country, fastest growing of the global economies with 8.8% this year, and it's going to continue like that in the next decade if they continue with reforms. And what is at core of India's success? And I think here is also a learning point. 1.4 billion people are have their digitally ID. So a grandmother in Assam can now wire money to the grandchildren. Most have cells. It's very affordable. It almost doesn't cost any money because of so much competition in the telecom sector now in India that you can have access almost for free. It is fueling the digital economy, and there are now also, of course, companies moving into India. So Apple didn't produce any iPhones a few years ago in India. Next year, it's going to be 25% of all Apple's iPhones are going to be produced in India. So what this shows us is that a country's competitiveness is also up to the leaders. You have to be at the forefront when it comes to the new technologies. You also have to focus on productivity. You have to focus on good governance. So things are moving, and the artificial intelligence is at least as important as the internet. Some people would say it's like electricity. I think that is to be seen. But when the growth is coming in these areas and you have a productivity potential of 30% in the coming decades, you have to move. If you're slow, you will see that you're going down on the rankings. If you're fast, you're going to get more prosperous.
Your Excellency, back to you on the question of debt. How do you think about this challenge, and what is Qatar's role in addressing it, not only domestically, but across the MENA region?
As everyone mentioned, debt is a big issue, and I think the biggest challenge, facing countries around the globe, it is debt. And I think that became also so significant because of the increased interest rates, as we know, in the recent 2 years in fight for inflation, through different economies. So this is really what made that, so difficult, for countries to deal with. In Qatar, as I said, I mentioned, that we have built a fiscal policy framework, medium term, which is, that is part of the targets, to have a reasonable debt to GDP target. And already, actually, Qatar, we came down from 72% debt to GDP in 2020 to below 40%, just by end of 2022. So, that, definitely is an issue, and it's very important for the countries. And the way to fight it is really economical growth. This is what you can achieve. But globally, I think, it's very important that, we have to work together with the multilateral organizations individually. Qatar has been very active in working, with the multilateral organizations. We have, contributed, to 2 funds from the IMF, the BRGT fund and RST fund. And we have basically, pledged 25% of our SDRs, with the IMF to contribute to these funds. Also, Qatar Development Fund, also working very actively, directly and bilaterally, with many countries in terms of supporting countries where we have helped certain countries even to meet their deficit targets and everything. So in terms of I think it's a very important subject, and I agree with my colleagues here, in the panel, that this is something that, it should be a global fight, and we have seen it in the past. We have seen the Asian financial crisis in 1997. We have seen, the financial crisis in 2008. If we let these, debt crisis and financial crisis really a spillover is going to be all over the world. So we cannot be isolated. I think you mentioned something about someone's debt is someone else's asset, It's true, yes, it's correct, but I think sometimes these assets don't get paid, and it's dangerous, if it doesn't get paid. So it's very important that we make sure that we have equal growth system, across the world. We should not ignore, countries with issues. We should, work together in the multilateral system. Very important that, we don't allow any countries really to go through some hassles. There are so many tools, I think, for the world. We have seen, the French club, and we have seen other activities, sometimes targeted to certain countries, and where everybody comes together and they do certain tools in terms of interest rate reductions, waivers, grace periods. But very important, as I say, is that these, activities, I think, through individual countries or the bilateral or the multilateral system, we have to really make sure, the debt control is becoming easier, while until, it comes to a level where these countries achieve the economical growth that can help them to pay off their debt, going forward. It's very important, issue.
As someone who sits on the board of QIA, does any of this impact your investment decisions or your thinking when it comes to deploying sovereign capital?
Yes. QIA, has an investment strategy that gets reviewed every year, and the investment strategy is based on geography, based on sectors, and which sectors we should get more allocation than other sectors. And of course, we also review the risks, associated with this investment, as we go along. So, I mean, in terms of like, I think our diversification of investments and the allocation of investments literally help us to mitigate any kind of risk, including, inability of countries or inability of companies to pay back, the investment. But definitely, I mean, we play a very, strict risk profile. And what we noticed that, usually, not countries that really the problem as much as the individual investment itself, and issues having with the individual investment. But in terms of like, performance, we have a good performance because, as I said, because we are very much diversified in our portfolio, diversified through sectors, through regions, through instruments, of investment.
We've just seen a stake sell down in Barclays, and I'm curious to get a sense from you, just from the QIA perspective, about where the opportunities are in the year ahead, and perhaps could you also elaborate on that decision?
We are investors, so we are opportunistics. When we see a good performance in a share and a good, to sell, we sell, and we go to somewhere else. So this is normal, So as you've seen, we always get in and out. We don't have, such thing, we hold on to investment forever. So, I think it was a good opportunity. We came to Barclays during, the financial crisis when the share price was very low, and we exited, at the right time when we got the opportunity.
Thank you for indulging me with a very CNBC question, so I appreciate it. Let's shift the focus back over to climate as well, because this is something that you were talking about before, and I think this is very important, particularly against the backdrop of the COP28 conversation taking place in Dubai. When it comes to climate, what does a just transition look like for Africa, and how are you thinking about these issues of economic growth, climate, and of course debt when it comes to this conversation?
Well, let me first start with something. I'll come back to climate that both Bunge said and the minister. I think that Bunge was said about new tools in a new world, and the minister was talking about the multilateral financial institution. Whether it's climate, whether it's debt, whether it's trying to close infrastructure gap, or whether it's trying to prepare for the next pandemic, the multilateral financial institutions are going to be critical for that. And I want to say this because of you mentioned the issue of the special drawing rights. The special drawing rights are essentially issued by IMF. $650 billion of that was issued. Okay. But Africa, with a population of 1.4 billion people, actually got only $33 billion out of that. So essentially what that means is that the conditional financing mechanism globally is underserving Africa. Just like the same thing we had during COVID. During COVID, everybody was getting booster shots, second shots, third shots. Africa was struggling to find just one. The developed countries spent $17 trillion on fiscal stimulus, right? 19% of the global GDP. Africa got only $83 billion. So the point I want to say is that we need to use the tools we have as we call for the reform of the global financial architecture. We can't just change the building. We have to change the plumbing inside of it. So, which means that the tools that we have today, the special drawing rights, has to be better optimized, has to be stretched, okay? And we work very closely with the IMF, of course, as the minister said, with the PRGT and the RST within IMF, fine. But what we have said is that there's another option. And that option is to make sure that we can stretch whatever money we have. And so we came up together with the Inter-American Development Bank with the SDR rechanneling option to multilateral development banks. And what that model shows is, first, rechanneling SDR to the multilateral development banks gives you a leverage factor of 4. Okay, so $1 becomes $4. Okay, and that's very, very important in a world where it's very limited resources. You have to be able to stretch it. The second is that the model that we developed actually satisfies according to the IMF staff, the reserve asset quality to preserve that SDR, which is very, very important. And of course, the third part of it is that when you rechallenge to multilateral development banks, you lose absolutely nothing. We pay for the cost of the IMF. So for the taxpayer, it's absolutely zero cost to it. And the reason I'm saying this is that whether you're talking about how we respond to climate, and we keep saying we have to go from billions to trillions, There aren't any trillions hanging around trying to go somewhere. We've got to get smarter about how we use financial instruments and get the most out of it. If, for example, for us at the African Development Bank, we were to get $20 billion of SDR rechanneling to us, that will automatically become $80 billion for Africa, just like that. And if the world were to reissue SDRs, let's say you reissue SDR to deal with climate, debt, all these pandemics and all of those things, of $500 billion, that will give you $2 trillion. Secretary General Guterres and I were talking about it. He said, this is the best thing we have on the table. So let's make it work. I was discussing it with the minister today about that MDB effort. The reason being that the MDBs, we are like leveraging machines. We make things to multiply. Now, I just want to say that because I'm looking at my brother, the Minister of Finance, and I've already reached out to him to see how I can get a little bit of SDRs from him. You know, Minister, if we can get SDRs to work like that, perhaps we might also change the name a little bit. Maybe we can call it Supporting Development Revitalization, because that's also SDR. Things can really happen at scale.
You need to convince Kristalina with that.
No, she was on the same panel, and she agrees with me completely. So we're looking forward to making that happen before the IMF spring meetings. Now, to your point about the issue of climate, I think the most important thing about climate, again, is how you raise the money for it. But I've already said that in first part, but I want to just make one point, which is a very strategic point for Africa. Everybody talks today about the fact that you can do carbon offsets, right? And that is where it brings me to the case of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that you were talking about, which I've said that it's good in Europe in the sense that you have a emission trading system, you cap and trade, and you want to make sure you reduce emissions, fine. But it has a negative impact on Africa. The reason is because African companies that are making cement, that are making steel, that are making aluminum, that are making fertilizers, that try to export to Europe are going to be charged a border tax of 80 euros per ton. Okay? So that is very, very expensive. All that's going to do is that countries in Africa that already suffer from tariff escalation, right, when they add value to whatever they produce, now you're forcing them down the value chain. And at the same time, the principle of collective but differentiated responsibility within the Paris Agreement says that the developed countries should peak in the first part of the 21st century and then go to net zero. In the second part of the 21st century, developing countries should peak and then go to net zero. So you are shifting the goalposts from then to now, and Africa is going to lose $25 billion, according to analysis done by folks out of the Africa Climate Foundation. I do think that in Europe, I salute what they are doing, but Africa deserves a carve-out on that because we are financing Africa's transition, energy transition to your point. And we are doing renewable energy. At the African Development Bank, we put 87% of all our financing for energy is in renewable energy. So I don't need to be lectured about renewable energy, but I know that you cannot industrialize just by renewables. You need to have a balanced energy mix that allows you to use your natural gas to be able to industrialize, okay? But when that happens and you now have to export to Europe, now Africa is going to get penalized for that. That's why I'm saying, I'm glad that you're here, that for us, just trade is what we need, but just trade for just energy transition. We can't just basically now cap Africa out, make us lose while we are in the process of transitioning. I think this is very, very important because if we're talking about Africa mobilizing resources, it cannot be losing $25 billion a year and then be penalized. It can't, look, we only contribute 3% of all the emissions anyway, you know, and the total amount of room available in the world today, then, for any emission is 400 gigatons. Developed countries use up 4,000 gigatons of it. So give Africa some room to be able to develop, to be able to have a stable energy mix, to be able to mobilize more resources, but don't cut it off from access to market. Give us just trade for just energy transition.
Borger, I'll get you to weigh in on this as well, particularly from a European policymaker's perspective. Can you tax your way to a cleaner climate? I spoke with the managing director, Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF just last week. She says there has to be a price on carbon in order to tilt the register when it comes to addressing climate action. But it would appear that there are some pretty deep divisions across the continent of Africa about exactly what that needs to look like. So what's your view?
It's true that in the polarized, fractured world we're living today, it's hard to agree on difficult issues that even move without the passport. Pandemics, climate change, because that takes two to tango. It also needs to be a willingness to find common ground. When it comes then to taxing, of course, if you look in an economic textbook, it still makes sense to internalize externalities. So if you do something that the government wants to see less of, you can put a price on it, and then you can hope for a different behavior. So for example, back 20 years ago, we decided when I was Minister of the Environment of Norway to put a CO2 tax on gas flaring offshore. Very controversial among the oil companies the first weeks. They lobbied against it. When we had passed in the parliament, after half a year, we had very little revenues from those CO2 taxes because they found technology that was cheaper to install than paying the CO2 tax. So in that sense, it works. Politically today, I don't think we are close to any kind of agreement to put a global price on carbon. That's why we have to think differently. Politics is also to look at opportunities. We can look at this area like, is the glass half full or half empty? There's a lot of positive things. If we met 10 years ago and I said that the price of solar would fall to 1/10 and needs no subsidies at all to be rolled out, I think that would be seen a bit naive. On wind, it has fallen to 1/7. So all the renewables can now be scaled up and they can be installed all over the world without any kind of subsidies. But we also need a lot of energy moving forward. And this is now, I think we're underestimating the complexity of build an industrial revolution on fossil fuel, and then to move into a society that is decarbonized takes time. And we're faced with the triangle. Energy access is still 800 million out there that doesn't even have electricity. Then tell us in Europe, energy security. You also want to know that you have electricity tomorrow or you will be faced a big deindustrialization. And then it's this growth in energy decoupled from growth in CO2 that will have to happen. But we have to then find bridges between coal as the most extreme version of fossil fuel through natural gas to more renewable societies. And we have to move in a speed that makes sense, that is cost effective, but also that takes into account that there is a price, as also Adesina was mentioning, in Africa today. You are seeing that areas that you could cultivate for agriculture in the past is not possible anymore. So there's a lot of silent changes that are happening that no one is really paying a price for. So the whole energy and climate piece is the most complex transformation we've been through as a planet and society in hundreds of years.
It speaks directly to the conversation that we're also having about fiscal sustainability. So, Your Excellency, I'll give you the opportunity to make some closing remarks here and perhaps also offer your thoughts on the role of Qatar as being a critical supplier of the world's energy needs, which will ultimately support economic growth moving forward. How are you thinking about this against the backdrop of the COP conversation happening in the UAE?
Thank you very much. I mean, I agree totally with my friend Borge in what he's saying exactly. Qatar is a responsible supplier of LNG, energy for the world. And, we believe the goals set, by the climate change was unrealistic goals, and too aggressive. And without thinking about the transit, period where to move from, a certain energy to a cleaner energy to a cleaner energy until you reach the zero emission control. So, and that's really what happened. Over years, there was a lack of investment, in the traditional fuel, supplies. And what happened as a result of this, the demand kept going up while supply stopped. And that's why we had seen, the huge jump in the prices after the end of COVID, period. So, and it will continue because, we still believe, the supply is not sufficient because of the lack of the investment and the restrictions made by, many jurisdictions, in the investment in the energy. In Qatar, we believe like natural gas will be the transit energy. It's much cleaner than other fuel, and it should be adopted as actually the transit energy. We have invested in increasing our production by 65%, and we should, we should reach the maximum of that production by 2027. By 2029, Qatar, will be responsible for 40% of the new LNG of the world, in 2029. So, having said this, I think it's very important. And even, I saw your, I heard your question about applying taxes and the carbon and everything. I think this is going to be a virtuous circle if we do this, because then what's going to happen? It's going to reflect in inflations, and then goes back to the prices. So it's not going to be really a solution. It's going to be like punishing yourself, for doing that. It's very important, I think, for climate change, programs and everything, to be realistic and to sit down and really understand what are the growth, in the demand for energy, and what are the supplies, and how to move, slowly with the much cleaner energies until to reach net zeros. I think to put unrealistic targets does not help anyone, as we have seen. So it's, in our opinion, I think the issue of energy, I think is going to be very important that we look at it. It's not going to be, should not be done as part of a political agenda, or, at what we see sometimes, here it's a good slogan to talk about, in your campaign, but it's very important, I think, to be realistic. And what we have seen, in the recent years, I think Borje mentioned it, some countries went back to coal, mines, just recently, still people are, when we thought we were over with the coal, now the coal is back. So let's be realistic, this is the idea. So it's very important, as I said, to get back the investment, in the energy, in the cleaner energy going forward, which is, gas. I think it is, it's the right, transit energy for the world.
All right, a fascinating conversation so far. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll leave it there. But Akinwumi, Borge, and Your Excellency, thank you so much for contributing today, and thank you all for listening in. We appreciate it.